The steady hum of the quarantine chamber filled the room, a stark reminder of the confinement Carter had just stepped into. The human engineer, rugged in his jumpsuit stained with grease and soot, dropped his tool bag to the floor. He had only planned to fix a minor electrical fault on the galactic trade station before heading back to his ship. Now, he was stuck in a sterile white room with glowing walls and an unwelcome companion. On the other side of the room stood Lyrana, a tall and graceful figure. Her pale blue skin shimmered faintly under the chamber's light, and her white hair fell in perfect waves around her shoulders. She looked as if she had stepped out of a royal portrait, but the cold glare she gave Carter was anything but friendly. Dressed in a formal robe that seemed more suited for a diplomatic event than a quarantine, she crossed her arms and tilted her chin upward, as if the very air in the chamber offended her. "Why must I share this space with him?" Lyrana's voice was smooth but carried an edge of disdain. Her almond-shaped violet eyes narrowed as she glanced at Carter, clearly unimpressed. "Hey, lady," Carter shot back, his tone defensive. "I didn't sign up for this either. Blamed the bioscanners. They flagged us both for potential contamination. It's either this or a decontamination shower that'll burn our skin off." Lyrana's lips pressed into a thin line. "I would prefer solitude over this." Carter let out a dry laugh and shook his head. "Well, tough luck, princess. We're both stuck here for 72 hours, so you might want to tone down the attitude." Lyrana's nostrils flared, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned her back to him and began inspecting the small living quarters provided in the chamber. There were 2 single cots, a basic food dispenser, and a shared sanitation unit. It was functional but far from luxurious. For someone like Lyrana, who was clearly used to finer things, this was undoubtedly a nightmare. Carter, meanwhile, slumped onto one of the cots and stretched out, placing his arms behind his head. He watched Lyrana as she moved with an air of precision, as if even walking across the room required a sense of grace. "Don't worry," Carter said after a moment. "I don't bite." "I'm not worried about your habits," she replied coolly. "I am concerned about how a species as primitive as yours managed to reach this station." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Primitive? Wow, okay. Guess you missed the part where humans have been hauling trade goods here for decades. If we're so primitive, why are you breathing the same air as me?" Lyrana froze mid-step, her back still turned. Carter could see her shoulders stiffen before she took a slow, deliberate breath. When she turned around, her expression was calm but icy. "I am here because diplomacy requires interacting with all species, regardless of their shortcomings." Carter chuckled. "Diplomacy, huh? Sounds exhausting. I just fix things. No politics, no fancy speeches, just wires and bolts. Perhaps if you focused on advancement rather than maintenance, your species would be taken more seriously," she retorted. Carter smirked. "Right, because advanced species like you have never needed a mechanic to save the day." Their banter was interrupted by the chamber's eye, which chimed in with a monotone voice. "Quarantine protocol initiated. Countdown. 71 hours, 50 minutes. The realization hit both of them like a brick. 3 days in this cramped space with no escape. Carter sighed heavily and swung his legs off the cot. "Well, this is gonna be fun." Lyrana sat gracefully on the other cot, folding her hands in her lap. She glanced at Carter, her expression unreadable. "Fun is not the word I would use." Carter shrugged and leaned back. "Suit yourself, princess. Just don't touch my stuff." For now, the quarantine chamber felt like a battlefield, one where words and stares would replace weapons. Neither of them knew that the coming hours would change their lives forever. The silence inside the quarantine chamber was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the air filtration system. Carter had spent the last hour fiddling with his multi-tool, tightening imaginary screws on his already well-maintained equipment. On the other side of the room, Lyrana sat perched on her cot like a statue, her violet eyes scanning the chamber as if she were inspecting a prison cell. "Is this how humans spend their time?" she finally asked, her tone laced with mockery. Tinkering with insignificant objects. Carter glanced up, a smirk tugging at his lips. Only when stuck in a box with someone who thinks staring at walls is productive. Lyrana didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she crossed her legs and smoothed her flowing robe, her movements elegant and deliberate. I was meditating. Something you might consider, given your lack of focus. Meditating, huh? Carter leaned back, resting his elbows on his cot. Is that code for avoiding conversation? Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she maintained her composure. It is a technique to calm the mind and prepare for challenges, a skill your kind might benefit from. Carter chuckled. Oh, we have our own way of dealing with stress. It's called complaining. Works wonders. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch of amusement crossed Lyrana's lips, but she quickly suppressed it. She wasn't about to let this human think he'd won any ground. The chamber's food dispenser beeped, signaling a meal was ready. Carter stood and approached the machine, pulling out a tray with 2 sealed compartments. He turned and held it up. Lunch is served. I hope you like mystery paste. Lyrana tilted her head, clearly unimpressed. Human sustenance lacks refinement. What is it made of? Carter popped open one of the compartments and grimaced at the beige, gelatinous substance inside. Honestly, I try not to think about it. It tastes like cardboard dipped in sadness. She raised an eyebrow. And you willingly consume this? He shrugged. Survival, princess. It's not about taste. It's about not starving. Lyrana hesitated, then rose gracefully from her cot. She approached the dispenser, her movements as precise as ever. She retrieved her own tray and inspected the contents with a critical eye. This is unacceptable, she muttered, her expression betraying her distaste. Welcome to quarantine dining, Carter said, sitting back down. He scooped a spoonful of the paste and made a show of grimacing as he swallowed. It grows on you, like mold. Lyrana sat across from him, her posture perfect even in this less than ideal setting. She took a cautious bite, her face neutral, but her displeasure evident in the way she set the spoon down after a single taste. I've had worse, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. High praise, Carter quipped, finishing his portion with an exaggerated flourish. For a moment, they ate in silence, the tension between them softening ever so slightly. Carter noticed Lyrana glancing at him occasionally, as if studying him. What? He asked, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. You are different from what I expected, she admitted reluctantly. He raised an eyebrow. Is that a compliment or an insult? Lyrana considered her words carefully. Merely an observation. Your kind is often portrayed as brash and impulsive, yet you show restraint. Don't get used to it, Carter said with a wink. She sighed, clearly unimpressed with his attempt at humor. I'm trying to understand how humans have managed to survive in this galaxy. You lack the technological advancements of many other species. Survival isn't just about tech, Carter replied, his tone serious now. It's about adaptability. We figure things out, even if it's messy. Lyrana studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Perhaps there is more to your kind than I realized. Stick around, princess, he said, leaning back with a grin. You might just learn something. Lyrana rolled her eyes, but for the first time, her demeanor seemed a little less cold. As the hours stretched on, the lines between hostility and curiosity began to blur. Neither of them realized that their reluctant partnership was just beginning. The hours dragged on in the quarantine chamber, and the tension between Carter and Lyrana remained palpable. Despite the occasional exchange of words, the silence often returned, thick and uncomfortable. Carter lay on his cot, tossing a ball against the wall and catching it, while Lyrana sat at the edge of hers, gazing at a small crystalline pendant in her hand. Carter finally broke the quiet. What's that? He asked, nodding toward the pendant. Lyrana hesitated, her fingers closing around it protectively. It's personal. Carter raised an eyebrow, catching the ball midair. Fair enough. Just curious. Looks important. "It is," she replied, her voice softer than before. "It belonged to my sister." The unexpected vulnerability in her tone caught Carter off guard. He sat up, resting his elbows on his knees. "She's not around anymore, is she?" Lyrana shook her head, her white hair cascading over her shoulders. "No, she perished during an uprising on our homeworld." Her violet eyes flickered with pain as she looked at the pendant. "This is all I have left of her." Carter nodded, his voice gentle. "I'm sorry. Losing family, it doesn't get easier." Lyrana studied him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. "You have lost someone as well." "Yeah," Carter admitted. "My brother. He was a pilot. Went down in a skirmish a few years back. One moment he was there, cracking jokes, and the next, he trailed off, staring at the floor. Sometimes it feels like he's still around, you know." Lyrana's expression softened, her usual icy demeanor melting for a brief moment. "I understand." The memories linger, both a comfort and a torment. A comfortable silence fell between them, the first they'd shared since their confinement began. The chamber's AI interrupted the moment with a mechanical chime. "Environmental systems error detected. Temperature regulation compromised. Repair protocols engage. Estimated resolution time, 6 hours." The room's temperature immediately began to climb. Carter cursed under his breath, tugging at the collar of his jumpsuit. "Great, just what we needed." Lyrana frowned, beads of perspiration already forming on her forehead. "This is unacceptable. The chamber should have safeguards to prevent such failures." "Yeah, well, welcome to budget cut engineering," Carter said, already on his feet. He moved to the wall panel and pried it open with his multi-tool. "Let me see if I can fix this before we both roast." Lyrana watched as he worked, his hands deftly navigating the wires and circuits. "You seem confident," she remarked. "It's not my first time dealing with overheating systems," Carter replied, his voice muffled as he leaned closer to inspect a cluster of connections. "One time, my ship's coolant line blew in the middle of an asteroid belt. Had to patch it with duct tape and prayers." "Duct tape?" Lyrana asked, tilting her head. Carter grinned. "A human miracle. Fixes everything." "Unfortunately, I don't think we've got any here." As he worked, the temperature continued to rise. Lyrana's usually composed appearance began to falter, her skin glistening with sweat. Carter glanced back and noticed her discomfort. "You holding up okay?" he asked. "I will endure," she said firmly, though her voice betrayed her struggle. Carter returned to the panel, his movements quick and precise. After a few tense minutes, he let out a triumphant noise. "Got it." The chamber's ventilation system roared to life, cool air pouring into the room. Both of them sighed in relief as the temperature began to drop. Lyrana stood, smoothing her robe as she regained her composure. "You may lack refinement, Carter, but your resourcefulness is admirable." "Was that a compliment?" Carter asked, smirking. "Do not push your luck," she replied, though there was a faint hint of amusement in her voice. As the chamber settled into a more comfortable state, Carter leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. "You know, Princess, for someone who looked ready to strangle me a few hours ago, you're not half bad. And for a human with no apparent sophistication, you are tolerable." Lyrana replied, her tone light, but with a spark of playfulness. For the first time since their forced confinement, they both smiled. A small but significant step toward bridging the gap between two very different worlds. The atmosphere in the quarantine chamber had shifted. What started as a battle of words and egos was slowly transforming into something more tolerable, even cooperative. Carter leaned against the wall, watching Lyrana examine the pendant she had shared a story about earlier. For the first time, her guarded expression seemed to soften, and he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of camaraderie growing between them. Their temporary peace was interrupted when the chamber's AI voice chimed again. "Warning. Contamination detected. Subject 2 is displaying irregular biosigns." Carter straightened up instantly, his eyes snapping to Lyrana. "Subject 2. That's you. What's going on? Lyrana stiffened, her violet eyes narrowing as she clenched the edge of her cot. I am uncertain. Her voice wavered, something Carter hadn't heard before. Before he could press further, she winced, her hands going to her temples. Her usually flawless blue skin shimmered faintly silver, a sheen of sweat forming across her forehead. Hey, you don't look so good, Carter said, stepping closer. Sit down, take it easy. Lyrana shook her head, though her movements were sluggish. I am fine. This is nothing. That's a lie if I've ever heard one, Carter said, kneeling beside her. Let me take a look. She hesitated, her pride warring with the obvious pain she was in. Finally, she relented, sitting back down on the cot. Do not touch me, she said firmly, but her voice lacked its usual sharpness. Wasn't planning to, Carter replied, his tone gentle. He grabbed a handheld scanner from his toolkit and ran it over her. The screen flickered with unfamiliar readings, alien symbols flashing in patterns he couldn't decipher. Yeah, this thing's not built for whatever your physiology is, he muttered. You gotta help me out here, Lyrana. What's normal for you? She exhaled shakily, her hand gripping the edge of the cot. My body reacts poorly to prolonged artificial atmospheres. This chamber's air is too sterile. Carter frowned. You mean you're allergic to the air? In a manner of speaking, she replied, her voice strained. My body requires certain trace elements that are absent here. Without them, my systems begin to fail. Great, Carter muttered, standing up and pacing. Why didn't you mention this sooner? I did not anticipate being trapped in such primitive conditions, Lyrana said, her irritation peeking through despite her weakened state. Carter ignored the jab and started digging through the chamber's supply lockers. There's gotta be something in here we can use to stabilize you. Medical kits, emergency supplements, anything. He found a small container labeled Universal Nutrient Supplements and held it up. These might work. Any of this looked familiar. Lyrana glanced at the container, her eyes dimming. They are insufficient. My requirements are specific. Carter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Of course they are. He paused, thinking. Then he snapped his fingers. Wait, what about the environmental controls? If we tweak the air composition, maybe we can simulate the elements you're missing. That is possible, Lyrana admitted, her voice faint. Then sit tight, Carter said, grabbing his multi-tool. He opened the wall panel he had fiddled with earlier and began accessing the environmental settings. Minutes passed as he worked, sweat forming on his brow from concentration. Lyrana's breathing grew heavier, each sound making Carter work faster. Come on, he muttered, adjusting the settings. Finally, he input a few commands and closed the panel. The chamber's eye chimed. Atmospheric modification in progress. Trace elements added. The change was subtle at first, a faint metallic tang in the air. Lyrana inhaled deeply, her shoulders relaxing almost instantly. Her skin's silver sheen faded, and some of her strength returned. She opened her eyes and looked at Carter, her expression unreadable. You did it. Carter grinned, though his relief was evident. Told you. Humans are good at figuring things out. Lyrana gave a faint nod, her usual arrogance softened by genuine gratitude. Perhaps I underestimated you. Don't worry, Carter said, sitting on the floor and leaning back against the wall. You're not the first. For the first time, a small, almost shy smile tugged at Lyrana's lips. It was fleeting, but Carter caught it. As the chamber settled into a calmer state, the two of them realized something had changed. In this moment of crisis, they had proven they could rely on each other, and neither of them would forget it. Carter leaned back against the cold chamber wall, letting out a long sigh of relief. The tension that had gripped the room was finally easing as the new atmospheric settings stabilized Lyrana's condition. She sat on her cot, her back straight as always, but her breathing had returned to a steady rhythm. The faint silver shimmer on her skin had faded, replaced by her usual pale blue hue. "You're tougher than you look," Carter said with a small smile. "Thought you were about to pass out on me there for a second." Lyrana turned her violet eyes toward him, her gaze softer than before. "I did not expect your ingenuity to succeed. It was a calculated risk." "Calculated risk?" Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "Princess, that was pure guesswork and a little luck." Her lips curved slightly, almost forming a smile. But she quickly masked it. "Luck or not, I am grateful. Your actions were commendable." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Was that a compliment? I didn't think you had it in you." Lyrana tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Do not let it go to your head, human." He grinned, enjoying the rare moment of levity. But before he could tease her further, the chamber's AI interrupted their exchange. "Warning. External systems malfunction detected. Communication relay offline. Estimated repair time, 24 hours. Carter frowned, sitting up straight. "Communication relay. What does that mean?" "It means," Lyrana said, her tone sharp again, "we are completely cut off from the rest of the station. No one can contact us, nor can we call for assistance." "Perfect," Carter muttered, running a hand through his hair. Just when things were starting to look up, Lyrana rose from her cot, her movements deliberate and composed. "The timing of these malfunctions is suspicious." Carter glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "You think someone's behind this?" "It is possible," she replied. "I am not unfamiliar with sabotage, especially when it comes to diplomatic missions. There are factions who would benefit from my failure." "Great," Carter said, standing and pacing the small room. "So not only are we stuck in here, but someone might be trying to take you out. Any other surprises I should know about?" Lyrana hesitated before answering. "If someone is targeting me, they may escalate their efforts. We must remain vigilant." Carter stopped pacing and faced her, his expression serious. "Well, if they come knocking, they'll have to get through me first." Lyrana raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "And what exactly will you do? Your tools are not weapons." He smirked. "I'll improvise. Humans are good at that, remember." She didn't respond immediately, but her gaze lingered on him, a flicker of something resembling respect in her eyes. As the hours passed, the two of them worked together to secure the chamber as best they could. Carter used his multi-tool to reinforce the door locks and jury-rigged a motion sensor using parts from the wall panel. Lyrana, despite her weakened state, provided strategic advice, her sharp mind proving invaluable. "Why do you care so much about helping me?" Lyrana asked at one point, her tone curious rather than cold. Carter paused, leaning against the wall. "Because it's the right thing to do. I don't care where you're from or how different we are. We're stuck in this mess together, and I'm not about to let anything happen to you." Her expression softened, and she nodded. "You are an unusual human, Carter." "I'll take that as a compliment," he replied with a grin. By the time they finished, the chamber felt slightly less vulnerable, though the tension between them remained. Lyrana sat back on her cot, her gaze fixed on Carter as he tinkered with his tools. "You surprise me, human," she said quietly. Carter looked up, his grin widening. "Stick around, princess. I've got plenty more surprises up my sleeve." For the first time, Lyrana allowed herself a small, genuine smile. In that moment, the gap between their worlds felt just a little smaller. The silence in the quarantine chamber was heavier than usual. The tension between Carter and Lyrana had only grown since the communication relay went offline, and now the strange malfunction was starting to feel more like a warning. Carter sat on his cot, his arms crossed, staring at the wall. Lyrana stood near the small window, her back straight, watching the stars outside. Both of them were lost in their thoughts. Carter broke the quiet first, his voice low but firm. "We need to figure out who's behind all this. Someone's trying to make us disappear." Lyrana turned toward him, her eyes sharp as always, but there was something in her gaze that seemed to soften. I agree. However, this may be more complicated than you realize. If I am indeed being targeted, those responsible are likely powerful, dangerous. I'm not scared of a little danger, Carter said, standing up and stretching. We've dealt with worse, right? Lyrana's lips tightened into a thin line. You may be brave, but even bravery does not protect one from the consequences of power. He looked at her then, sensing something deeper in her words. You've faced this kind of thing before, haven't you? Lyrana didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved to the small food dispenser and began preparing something that looked, for lack of a better word, suspicious. Carter watched her, his curiosity growing. Answer me, Lyrana. He pressed gently, stepping closer. What's going on here? Who's after you? She turned to face him, her violet eyes sharp as ever, but this time they lacked their usual ice-cold composure. I have been in diplomatic service for many years. I've made enemies. Powerful enemies. She paused, her voice faltering slightly. Not everyone approves of my mission, especially among the factions who want to maintain control of the system. They want to see me fail. Or worse, they want me out of the way. Carter's expression softened. And they think I'm some kind of threat to that plan. You are human, she said, her voice steady but quiet. That in itself is enough for some to consider you expendable. Carter frowned, his jaw tightening. So you think I'm just collateral damage? Lyrana's eyes met his, the distance between them closing for the first time. I did not want to think that, but sometimes that is the harsh reality of politics. To them, you're nothing but an inconvenience. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. Well, that's not gonna happen. I didn't survive this long to be someone's target. Lyrana studied him for a long moment before speaking again. I did not ask for your help, Carter. I did not expect you to care about my survival. Yeah, well, I don't just leave people behind, Carter said. His voice was firmer now, less like a joke. We're in this together, whether you like it or not. A long silence passed between them, and for the first time, Carter saw something flicker behind Lyrana's usual cold exterior, a crack in the armor. She seemed to consider his words, but then her gaze shifted, and her demeanor hardened again. You're right, she said quietly. We are in this together. Just as the moment seemed to settle, the chamber's AI voice crackled again, breaking their brief but intense conversation. Warning. Intruder alert detected. Motion sensors activated. Carter's heart skipped a beat, and he immediately moved to the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the makeshift weapon he'd fashioned out of spare parts. Who the hell is that? He muttered under his breath. Lyrana's posture became alert, her hand steady as she reached for a small device hidden in her robe. I knew it. They're here. The door rattled with a soft thud, and Carter's fingers tightened around the improvised weapon. We're not opening the door until we know who it is. Lyrana nodded, her face grim. We need to be cautious. They might have anticipated this. Carter was about to speak when the sound of footsteps outside the door became clearer. Someone was getting closer. He glanced at Lyrana, his expression determined. No one's getting past us, he said, his voice low and resolute. They both moved silently, positioning themselves near the door, ready for whatever was about to come next. The silence grew thick, and every second stretched into what felt like an eternity. The sound of the footsteps stopped, and the chamber fell into a tense stillness. Carter's grip on his makeshift weapon tightened. They're right outside, he whispered, his eyes focused on the door. Lyrana took a deep breath, her eyes hard and calculating. Whatever happens, Carter, we face it together. Carter nodded. Together, he repeated, as the door's locking mechanism hummed in preparation for whatever was about to happen. The footsteps outside the quarantine chamber had stopped, leaving an eerie silence hanging in the air. Carter stood at the door, his makeshift weapon gripped tightly in his hand, every muscle in his body coiled and ready for whatever was about to happen. Lyrana, standing beside him, was equally tense, Her eyes locked onto the door with a sharp, calculating focus, her hand hovering near the small device she had pulled earlier. Neither of them spoke, the tension thick as they waited for the next move. Then, without warning, the door control panel beeped, and the door slowly began to hum open. The sound was quiet but unmistakable. Carter's heart raced, his grip on his weapon tightening. "Ready?" he whispered, not taking his eyes off the door. Lyrana nodded, her expression hard. "Always." The door slid open with a quiet whoosh, revealing a figure standing in the dimly lit hallway just outside the chamber. Carter squinted, trying to make out who it was. The silhouette was tall, broad-shouldered, and human, a soldier in uniform, with a gun holstered at his side. "I didn't expect it to be you," Carter muttered, stepping forward. The soldier didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his face hidden under the shadow of his helmet. His voice finally broke the silence, low and steady. "You've been causing some trouble, engineer." Carter straightened, lowering his weapon just slightly, but still cautious. "We've been stuck in here, and something's been messing with our systems. I'm not in the mood for games." Lyrana stepped forward, her presence commanding. "Who sent you?" Her voice was calm, but there was a clear edge to it. The soldier glanced at her, his gaze momentarily flickering. "I'm not here to answer questions." "Then what are you here for?" Carter demanded, his voice rising slightly. The soldier's hand reached up to his helmet, and with a soft hiss, he removed it, revealing a face that Carter immediately recognized. "I'm here because I'm under orders to make sure you both stay right where you are." Carter's eyes narrowed. "You? What? You're one of them." The man nodded. "I'm sorry, Carter, but this is bigger than you or me. Lyrana, your mission. It's too dangerous. We can't let you leave this station." Lyrana's expression hardened as she took a step forward. "You've been working against me this whole time." The soldier hesitated but then nodded. "Yes, it wasn't personal. It was necessary." Carter felt his stomach drop. "You've been behind the sabotage, the malfunctions, all of this." The soldier didn't respond immediately, and the silence between them was heavy. Finally, he spoke again. "We've had orders from higher up. Your mission to this sector wasn't just a diplomatic effort. There are those who think it's too much of a risk. They want you off the station. Permanently." Lyrana's eyes flashed with fury. "You're working for them. Traitor." The soldier's face didn't betray any emotion, but his voice softened. "I don't have a choice, Lyrana. You don't understand the consequences. The political instability you bring could threaten everything we've worked for." Carter glanced between Lyrana and the soldier, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "So what happens now? You've got a gun, and we're trapped in here. You're just going to kill us." The soldier sighed deeply, a long, regretful breath. "I don't want to, but I don't have a choice." Carter took a step forward, lowering his weapon completely. "Then make a choice." The soldier's eyes flickered in surprise, but Carter's voice was firm. "If you want to kill us, then do it. But if not, then you need to listen to us. You're not just working for the good of the station. You're being played." For a long moment, the soldier didn't respond. The weight of Carter's words seemed to hang in the air between them. Finally, he took a deep breath, as if coming to a decision. "You don't get it," he muttered, shaking his head. "But I can't do this anymore." With a sudden movement, he dropped his gun to the floor, his hands raised in surrender. "I'll help you get out, but you have to promise me something." Carter didn't lower his guard, but he was confused. "What?" The soldier met his eyes, the tension still thick in the air. "When this is over, you'll make sure no one else gets caught in the middle of this. No more innocent people. Promise me that." Carter studied him for a moment, the gravity of the soldier's request settling in. He glanced at Lyrana, who stood still, watching both men closely. Finally, he nodded. "I promise," Carter said, his voice low but steady. "We'll figure this out together." The soldier gave a reluctant nod. Then let's get you both out of here before they send someone else." As Carter and Lyrana followed the soldier down the hall, they knew this was far from over. But for the first time in days, they had a chance. And together, they were ready to take it. The hallway was quiet, far too quiet for Carter's liking. His every step echoed, and he kept his eyes on the soldier who had unexpectedly become their reluctant ally. The soldier, once standing so firmly against them, now led the way down the narrow corridor, his movements tense but purposeful. Carter could feel the weight of the situation pressing on all of them, but he refused to back down. Lyrana walked beside him, her usual composed demeanor still in place, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, an emotion Carter couldn't quite read. Whatever it was, he didn't want to ask. It was clear that even though she'd survived diplomatic crises before, this wasn't something she had expected. "So," Carter said, breaking the silence, "how do we know you're not just leading us into a trap?" The soldier glanced back at him, his expression hard. "You don't. But if I wanted you dead, I would have done it back in that chamber." Carter wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't argue. The soldier had, after all, just surrendered his weapon. That meant something. "We need to get to the main docking bay," the soldier continued, his voice low. "It's the only way off this station without them knowing. But we need to move fast. There's no telling how much time we have before reinforcements arrive." Lyrana's eyes narrowed. "And how do you know all this? You're not exactly an ally of mine." The soldier didn't turn around this time, but his voice carried a quiet bitterness. "I was assigned to monitor you. I wasn't given the full picture, but I know enough to see the bigger problem now." He paused before adding, "You're not the real threat. It's the people behind this whole mess." Carter shot a quick look at Lyrana, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of understanding between them. They both knew that the soldier wasn't the only one caught in the middle. Whoever was pulling the strings was far more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. The soldier led them through a series of corridors, moving with the confidence of someone who had spent years navigating the station's back channels. Carter and Lyrana followed, their footsteps echoing as they moved deeper into the station's core. After a few more twists and turns, they arrived at a small service lift. The soldier keyed in a code on the panel, and the lift door opened with a soft hiss. Without hesitation, he stepped inside. "Get in," he said, motioning for Carter and Lyrana. Carter hesitated for a moment, then glanced at Lyrana. She nodded, stepping in after the soldier. Carter followed, and the door slid shut behind them. The lift began its descent, the hum of the engine vibrating through the small cabin. As they went lower into the station, the air grew colder and the light became dimmer. Carter could feel the tension rising once again. "What happens after we reach the docking bay?" Lyrana asked, her voice sharp. The soldier didn't look at her, but spoke with cold certainty. "We leave. The station won't be able to stop us if we get to the bay. But the real question is what happens after we're off this station. If we make it out, it's only a matter of time before they come after us." Carter's fists clenched. "Then we'll be ready." Lyrana's eyes flickered with something like agreement, but it was fleeting. "I didn't come all this way just to be hunted down like prey," she said quietly. "If we're going to survive this, we need to make sure we don't just escape. We need to make sure we end this." The soldier gave a single nod. "I'm with you, but that's not going to be easy. These people, they've planned for every possibility." The lift finally came to a halt with a soft thud, and the doors opened to reveal a small, dimly lit docking bay. Carter stepped out first, scanning the area for any signs of trouble. It was empty. "We're not in the clear yet," the soldier said. "We need to get to the ship. Now." Lyrana moved swiftly, her eyes scanning the shadows of the docking bay as she kept pace with Carter. The soldier followed behind them, his eyes darting nervously. As they approached the ship, a sleek, unmarked vessel, Carter felt a glimmer of hope. They were almost free, but he knew that wouldn't last. The real fight was coming. "Get in," the soldier urged. "I'll stay behind and cover your escape." Carter turned to him, his expression grim. "You don't have to do this. We can fight together." The soldier shook his head. "No time for that. If I go with you, they'll track you down before you can even leave the station. This is the only way." Carter hesitated but nodded. "Thanks for everything." Lyrana placed a hand on Carter's shoulder. "Let's go." The doors to the ship slid open, and they both climbed inside, the engine's hum starting to life. As they lifted off from the station, Carter looked back at the soldier one last time. He saw him standing there, watching them go. Then the station vanished from view. The silence in the ship's cockpit was almost suffocating as the stars outside stretched into streaks of light, signaling their escape from the station. Carter sat at the controls, his hands gripping the ship's controls as the hum of the engine surrounded him. Lyrana sat beside him, her eyes focused on the view screen, watching the dark expanse of space ahead. Neither of them spoke, both lost in their thoughts after everything they had just gone through. Carter couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that they were free. For now. But even as they drifted further away from the station, a part of him knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The people who had tried to trap them, the ones who saw Lyrana as a threat, they weren't the kind to let it go. He had a feeling that the real fight was just beginning. "So," Carter said, breaking the silence, "where do we go now?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge of exhaustion in it. Lyrana turned to him, her face unreadable. "We find a place where we can lie low. Somewhere far from their reach. A system where they won't be able to track us easily." Carter nodded. "Got it, but that's not going to be easy. We're probably not the only ones trying to hide from these people." She looked out the window again, her eyes narrowing. "You're right, but I've been to places where even the most advanced technology can't find you. We'll be fine. For now." Carter raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You have some secret hideout tucked away, don't you?" Lyrana glanced at him, her lips twitching into the hint of a smile. "I'm not telling you anything until I know I can trust you." "Fair enough," Carter said with a grin, but his mind was already racing. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not when they were still so vulnerable. The ship continued its smooth flight through space, heading further into the unknown. Carter checked the ship's systems, making sure everything was running as it should. The last thing they needed now was for the ship to break down. Lyrana's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You never did tell me why you helped me." Carter glanced at her, his expression softening. "I already told you. It's the right thing to do." He paused, looking at the stars ahead. "Besides, you're not so bad when you're not trying to freeze me out." She raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. They both knew that their journey wasn't over. There was too much at stake now. They couldn't afford to rest just yet. "I didn't expect you to be so persistent," she said after a while, her tone more thoughtful than usual. "Most humans would have given up or run the moment things got difficult." Carter chuckled. "Well, I'm not like most humans." Lyrana turned toward him, studying his face for a moment. "No, you're not. You're different." He smiled, but it was a tired one. "We're all a little different. That's what makes us interesting, right?" She didn't respond right away, as if contemplating his words. Then, after a long silence, she spoke again. "I didn't come here just to run from my problems. I came because I believed in something bigger than myself. I thought I could make a difference. But now I see how fragile everything really is." Carter nodded, understanding her pain. "Yeah, things never really go the way we think they will." Lyrana's gaze drifted to the stars outside once more, her expression distant. "No, but sometimes we have to keep going anyway." He didn't have an answer to that, so they fell into silence once more. They both knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but for the first time, Carter didn't feel completely alone in it. The ship hummed quietly as they made their way through the vastness of space. The unknown stretched out before them, full of possibilities and dangers, but also a strange sense of freedom. Carter glanced at Lirana again, his mind still racing with thoughts of what was to come. He didn't know how long they'd be able to stay hidden. He didn't know if they could ever truly escape the people who wanted them dead. But he did know one thing. He wasn't going to let them face it alone. They had come this far together. They were going to face whatever came next, together. And for the first time since their quarantine began, Carter allowed himself to believe that they might actually make it.